let us talk about organization of human auditory cortex and what we learned from it using intracranial electrophysiology studies in humans. Auditory cortex in primates, including humans, includes multiple areas that are hierarchically organized for serial and parallel processing of incoming auditory information. A highly influential model of primary auditory cortex considers three principal subdivisions. Core cortex includes primary and primary-like areas. Core auditory cortex, in turn, is surrounded by several belt areas, and those, in turn, are surrounded by parabelt areas. However, the homology between monkey and human auditory cortex is unclear, and the extent to which this model can be extrapolated or adapted to the human brain is uncertain. Part of this challenge stems from the fact that human auditory cortex is structurally complex and remarkably challenging to study. Why is this so? Auditory cortex in humans is located on the superior and lateral aspects of the superior temporal gyrus. The superior aspect of the superior temporal gyrus is termed superior temporal plane. It is the most structurally complex surface of the human cerebral cortex. Half of the gray matter within the superior temporal plane is hidden within its sulci, which of course makes the study of it ever more complicated. Also, there is a great deal of variability in anatomy across individuals, as well as between hemispheres in the same individual. And this is where intracranial electrophysiology studies can be incredibly helpful in refining the questions related to functional organization of auditory cortex in humans. One way to study functional relationship between different areas within auditory cortex is through examining onset-response latencies. That is, the time between beginning of an auditory stimulus and the beginning of the brain response to it. Such research has shown that onset-response latencies to speech syllables are the shortest in the posterior medial portion of Heschel's gyrus. That is a gyrus that runs within the superior temporal plane, and this is where primary auditory cortex is posited to be in humans. So the latencies are the shortest in the posterior medial portion of Heschel's gyrus, then they increase towards the anterolateral aspect of Heschel's gyrus. However, latencies on the lateral surface of the superior temporal gyrus are shorter than those in the anterolateral Heschel's. This suggests that at least a portion of superior temporal gyrus represents a fairly early non-core stage of cortical auditory processing in humans. Cortical connectivity patterns can be examined using electrical stimulation track tracing, when brief electric pulses are delivered to certain electrodes implanted in the brain, and responses to these pulses are examined elsewhere. Such work has shown that there is a projection from core auditory cortex in the posterior medial Heschel's gyrus to the superior temporal gyrus. Another study has demonstrated a projection from non-core auditory cortex in the lateral superior temporal gyrus to the inferior frontal gyrus, including Broca's area. Spectral organization, or orderly representation of sound frequencies within the brain region, is a ubiquitous organizing feature of the auditory system. It originates in the inner ear, where its different portions are maximally sensitive to sounds of different frequencies. Indeed, this organization is preserved in core auditory cortex. Further, there is evidence for a similar orderly spectral organization on the lateral STG, again reinforcing the idea that this area is a relatively early processing stage within the auditory cortical hierarchy. Representation of information about stimulus timing is another key organizational feature of the auditory cortex. A convenient way to study temporal processing in human auditory cortex is through the use of click trains. Research has shown that in core auditory cortex, changes in response patterns to trains of click stimuli parallel changes in perceptual properties of these stimuli, depending on their repetition rate. The basic response properties can thus be used as physiological markers to to delineate primary and putative non-primary auditory areas within the superior temporal plane. Moving on to more complex stimuli, research has shown that speech can be decoded from superior temporal gyrus high gamma activity. When spoken words are presented to the listener, recording sites can be described in terms of what frequency components of the sounds they're most responsive to and when those responses occur. This information can then be used for reconstruction of the spectrogram of the original stimulus that the listeners heard. And sites that contribute the most to such reconstruction are located on the lateral surface of the superior temporal gyrus. Spectrotemporal tuning supports phonetic feature encoding in the superior temporal gyrus. Research has demonstrated distributed spatial temporal patterns of high gamma activity on STG during listening to speech. And speech-responsive sites in this cortical region are selective to specific groups of phonemes. Cortical responses to speech are affected by task demands. For example, consider an experiment where the listener is presented with different words, for example, cat, dog, 5, 10, that are spoken by different male and female talkers, and the listener has to perform multiple tasks. On the first run, the listener is required to press a button when they hear a tone. On the second run, they ask to press a button when they hear an animal. Next, they instructed to attend to numbers. This research has demonstrated that responses to the same stimuli can be different depending on the task requirements. For example, on the lateral STG, there is a task effect, meaning that responses that are elevated to stimuli when they are presented within the context of a semantic categorization task. Further, if these stimuli are targets, that is to say, the stimuli that the listener is instructed to press the button to, there is a further elevation of responses to these stimuli that is seen in the areas that are further away from the lateral STG and that constitute so-called auditory-related cortex. These effects, the task and target effect, are lateralized such that they both are prominent in the left hemisphere. When the brain encounters simultaneous speech from multiple talkers, superior temporal gyrus has been shown to emphasize spectrotemporal features of the speech that the listener is attending to. Population responses in non-core auditory cortex on the lateral superior temporal gyrus has been shown to encode critical features of attended speech. This can be seen from speech spectrograms that are reconstructed from cortical activity. These reconstructed spectrograms emphasize the characteristic of the speech stream that the listener is attending to. Recording cortical activity during a dialogue between the experimenter and the subject themselves allows for comparisons between responses to heard and self-initiated speech. Research has shown that primary auditory cortex doesn't really care whether it's your own speech or somebody else's that you hear. Responses will be, in general, quite similar. However, in non-core regions, there is an emerging suppression of cortical activity that is associated with auditory responses to one's own speech, which makes sense because one could argue that one doesn't need to micromanage their own vocal output as they hear it. When data from multiple subjects are analyzed in this fashion and pulled together, it is revealed that suppression is localized to particular regions within the human auditory cortex. Speech production can be impaired by selective cooling of the relevant brain regions, an experiment that is possible during intraoperative studies. When a cooling probe is placed over Broca's area in the inferior frontal gyrus and experimental subjects are instructed to speak, cooling of this region affects speech timing. That is, speech becomes slower than normal. In contrast, cooling of speech motor cortex, that is when a cooling probe is placed over the laryngeal motor cortex, affects speech quality. speech becomes slurred. Also, what's interesting is that these effects are lateralized to the left hemisphere and are only present in those cases when the left hemisphere cortex is cooled, but not on the right. In conclusion, direct recordings from human auditory cortex reveal a complex hierarchical organization wherein activity in core auditory cortex faithfully represents its basic spectrotemporal speech properties. In contrast, a portion of auditory cortex on the superior temporal gyrus is hypothesized to represent a relatively early non-core processing stage, and activity within auditory related areas are strongly modulated by task conditions.